Blessings we are reap and we coursing on full. Oh, we not rise and boast. Yeah, we give thanks like we need it the most. We have to give thanks like we really supposed to be thankful. Blessings all for my life and my thank God for the journey, the earnings, not just for the plus. Yeah, and gratitude is a must. Yeah, we see blessings fall by my right hand, but I toast to the friends who take off every load. One time did sit down in a class and we scored then only get.
Hello, I am Jen Adams and I'm happy to get to work with you this summer. I'm coming to you from the University of Calgary, which is located on Mohkinstsis, the traditional Blackfoot name of where the Bow River meets the Elbow River, the place that we now call Calgary, Alberta. I am from Lenapehoking, the Lenape homeland of what is now called Brooklyn, New York. With gratitude, I honor the traditional caretakers of these lands and acknowledge the genocide and continuous theft of land and displacement of indigenous peoples in North America. I also recognize the stolen labor of enslaved Africans and the harm inflicted upon indigenous communities, Black people, and people of color in the settler colonial nations of the United States and Canada. I revisit this land acknowledgement because land, place, and knowledge are intricately tied. A decolonial stance towards science education considers this a part of the historicity and affords a critical understanding of social and learning relationships. In this presentation, each slide has an accompanying audio that you can access via the slide. Several slides also includes links to songs or podcasts. Some of these links are also included on the last reference slide, so you can access as you move through this module. I'm happy to be with you on this journey of a collective transformation of science and science education towards a more humane, just, and caring praxis and planet. I would like to start by giving you a brief overview of what we're going to be covering in this presentation. First, I have an activity for you to do, a short activity where you're going to be looking at images and think about what cultural narratives they tell us about what is science. Then I will have a brief discussion of the historical underpinnings of science and STEM, and then how these historical underpinnings, which produce colonial science, and also how they produce some of the societal inequities that we see today. And then finally talking about how to approach a decolonial stance in science education research. Here I'm going to ask you to engage with a brief activity. So if you can just open up your Google browser, and you're going to be doing a Google image search. First, I would like for you to search science. Again, looking at the images. Maybe write down a few words of the images that you see. What are the images? What are the words that come to mind for you that describe these images? Now I'm going to ask you to do the same thing with scientists. What do you notice with these images? How are they similar to the ones that you saw before? What do these images say about being a scientist? I don't know about you, but the images made me feel like science was being portrayed as being acultural, neutral, objective, disconnected from any emotion or lived experience, very unitary, very unified. And the stereotypes about who can practice science. While I was surprised to see that there were diverse scientists displayed both in gender and race-wise, I also found that as you would get the impression that there was only one way of practicing science, and that was in a laboratory with a lot of very complicated equipment around you. So what is that saying to our students? It's really not giving them a very wide range of ways that one can be in science. And this is a science that we practice in schools, universities, and most institutions. And it reflects the Western European colonial logics, which I will be talking about in the upcoming slides. The interest in STEM started well before the world wars but were catalyzed by the race to space and codified at the beginning of the millennium as a way to politicize these subjects, the science, technology, engineering, mathematics subjects, towards the increasing global competitive of the United States. Even noting in a recent National Science Foundation document, concerns about science and technology literacy in the U.S. focus on the relationship between STEM education and national prosperity and power. As such, the STEM acronym became codified in order to mobilize education and governmental policy, national innovation and competitiveness, national security, immigration and workforce development, job creation, and economics. So the language of power and capital gain underlies STEM today, and as such, STEM holds an elevated status in our society. And if we even look at many of those international measures, STEM is a very strong indicator as to whether a nation is well educated or considered economically competitive. So all of this is where STEM is codified and tied to capitalism, in addition to being tied to military and innovation and all those things, which are all monetized somehow.
It's like a jungle sometimes. It makes me wonder how I keep from going under. It's like a jungle sometimes. It makes me wonder how I keep from going under.
And just a snippet of a song from Grandmaster Flash. And really, the whole song talks about this notion of meritocracy. So I would like for you to watch the short video, the YouTube video, The Myth of Meritocracy, that's linked in this slide. And as you're watching it, I just want you to think about what it means for science education, because they are speaking about wealth and education attainment in general. But what do you think it means for science education? In my research group, we related this to the notion of neoliberal enclosure, saying that science education is based on exclusively owned plots of Western modern science. Following this reason, the language, skills, and values of Western modern science become a commodity that students must obtain in order to succeed in society, while non-Western knowledges are introduced as additional and or inferior material. Students who are trained in Western modern science then become professionals who reproduce the science and thus maintain Western modern science's status as the truth and the commodity for success in science education. Okay, here's just a brief overview of how STEM, or science that we know of and that we practice in the institution, came to be. The late Joe Kinchelow, who is a critical pedagogue, he described the Black Plague as a pivot for a shift from knowing and feeling to disconnected logic and reason as a main valid form of knowledge production. So Europeans at the time needed a way to explain the disease that was killing so many people and so rapidly with no seeming cure in sight. Almost like, it seems like a reflection of what we're experiencing today. And this really established the underpinnings, the cultural underpinnings of Western modern science, which is the separation of the knower from the known. The scientific revolution followed, I guess historically, not too far after the Black Plague period, and this was the establishment of the Cartesian Newtonian concept of scientific modernism, and quote, with its centralization, concentration, accumulation, efficiency, and fragmentation, this dualistic way of seeing reinforced a rationalistic, patriarchal, expansionist, social, and political order welded to the desire for power and conquest. Again, this is coming from Dr. Kinchelow. This spurred the age of European control through domination of nature and capitalism through the accumulation of land, people, and products. Importantly, notions about education developed from this era that emphasize not the production of knowledge but the learning of that which has already been defined as knowledge. So again, tying that knowledge to power and going back to that notion of meritocracy, with STEM being exclusively owned plots. This is seen today in our science classroom as their emphasis on standards that reduce science to memorizable facts rather than a focus on science as a human endeavor and the process of knowledge production as unfixed and ongoing. Race science emerged from Western modern science that was established as the objective truth. In the 1700s and early 1800s, scientists in Europe and the Americas studied race science, the idea that humankind is divided into separate and unequal races. They tried to explain the contradiction between the belief in human equality expressed during the American and French revolutions and the emergence of enslavement in the United States and several European countries. Race science, or scientific racism, was also the justification behind many immigration policies, apartheid, Jim Crow laws, Nazism, fascism, all justified by science that continues to shape ideologies about race today. In the link, you will find a podcast with Angela Saini, the author of Superior, The Return of Race Science. As you listen, think about how this might connect to meritocracy, or how it does connect to meritocracy, and how it shows up in science education. Jamaican anti-colonial philosopher is interested in race science because she looks how it has produced the overrepresentation of capital M, man. Her work describes how our contemporary conditions of humanness have been defined, and she works to unsettle this. Man has been described as a measuring stick of normalcy, and human others are excluded from the category of being, the standard to which all other humans are measured. Man, in which the other is defined by biological inferiority and is read unto the body of those deselected, racially, economically, sexually, etc., from the social and economic hierarchy. So even in this picture, you can see that even though it is a statue and the statue is going to come down, I don't know when, but Teddy Roosevelt is high on the horse and at the pinnacle of being described as man. He is white, he is cis, he is hetero, he is wealthy. And then you have the African man and the indigenous man as being deselected from that normalcy, from that high measuring or that apex of humanness. So one of the things that we do have to do in science education and teaching and learning is continue to do this work of unsettling who counts as human and how this shows up in the classroom, and what can we do to rehumanize students, all students, as learners or human beings worthy of learning, worthy of our care, and worthy of our compassion.
Whoa, oh, mercy, mercy me. All things ain't what they used to be now. Where did all the blue skies go? Poison is the wind that blows from the north and south and east. Whoa.
That's organic intellectual Marvin Gaye and his song The Ecology, and talking about some of the environmental racism. Even though this song was produced in the 70s, written and sung in the 70s, you can see from this headline that what he talks about is still relevant today. You can access the song in the link, and you can Google the lyrics if you wanted to investigate that a little bit further. On this slide, you see the Henrietta Lacks as a part of the headline. Many people, it's now required reading in a lot of courses, especially courses that talk about ethics and research. So this is how Henrietta, as a poor woman of color, her cells were taken and widely used, and a lot of medical advances that we have now are because of her cells, her halite line, and they were taken without consent, and neither her nor her family benefited from any of the patents and profit and anything that came from the use of her cells. And more recently, relatively recently, we can think about biases in AI and how artificial intelligence often reproduce human biases in the data and in the decisions that they make that often also reflect social inequities. So these are two areas that we can look at that where science has influence in. And even more recently, we can see how a lot of these racial, which is intersected with socioeconomic inequities, showed up in COVID. If we think about who were more likely to be essential workers, who were more likely, which communities had more outbreaks, which communities, what kinds of access to healthcare these different communities have, even with the education gaps, like when people had to move to online learning, who had environments that were more conducive to online learning than others, or even access to effective technology in order to do online learning. So these are all things to consider when we start to think about that intersection of science and equity. Okay, here is another example, and it's really this shows how racial bias can show up in medical care. So this was based on research where I forgot how many doctors were interviewed, and these were the perceptions that they had about black versus white. Black people's nerve endings are less sensitive. Black people's skin is thicker. Black people's blood coagulates. So with these types of beliefs, that's going to affect the type of care that someone has, whether they're going to receive that pain medication, whether they're going to be put on that ventilator, whether their complaints are going to be taken seriously or another. There's been many headlines in the news, especially recently, about both black and indigenous women in particular being denied a certain degree of care because of racial bias.
Reparations, unrequited. Persecutor, unrepentant. Now is the time to overturn the paradigm cruelly inflicted upon our people. Imperialist, elitist, supremacist systems, the cumulative pain of generations. Barbarically slain brothers and sisters, all in the name of racist agendas. Underhanded tactics break the auras of our black kids. There is no room for neutrality. We must dismantle this narrative. Compliant indifference is brutality. We will not stand for this. We need no permission to celebrate our blackness with every strike of the drum. We raise our fist to the sun, with no prior warning. It's our ancestors calling. We will not stand for this. We will not stand for this. Rise again. Rise again. Rise again. Rise again. Languages.
The fact that doctors aren't taught to look for symptoms that can appear differently on non-white skin prompted this medical student to create the handbook for diagnosing conditions in black and brown skin. This goes back to Sylvia Wynter's notion of man too and the overrepresentation of man, with white Eurocentric man being the default for everything. So taking a decolonizing stance requires us to understand that science as presented in curricula and practice in labs, museums, classrooms, and in many science learning spaces, and in the case of this example, in medicine, represent a particular worldview. It is neither acultural nor objective. Taking a decolonial stance means not eliminating Western science, but unpacking the epistemic, cultural, social, and historical injustices and biases that are attributed to the dominant colonial white supremacist culture from which it emerged. In the next slides, we will look at some things to consider when taking a decolonial, anti-colonial stance in science education research. In response to the neoliberal enclosure of science education that I mentioned earlier, our Urban Education Research Coven forwarded the Tritt-Kranz heuristic to shape both learning and science education research. Here, I will describe how the tenets can advance a colonial stance towards science education research. This is one of the assigned reading articles, so you should already have a notion of what the Tritt-Kranz heuristic is and how we, what frameworks we use to develop it. Contextualize and historicize knowledge. This allows us to examine how different communities have been engaged with knowledge production and how they influence each other through shared historical processes and intercultural encounters. We can think about anthropological constructs like creolization, the emergence of different contact languages. This allows us to ask the questions: which histories have been forefronted, which have been erased? How and why have they been erased? How have these historical intercultural connections influenced the advancement of science and technology, what we consider Western science and technology? Thomas Kuhn, the author of the seminal works, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which is required readings for many courses, and many of you probably have read it. If not, you've you heard about it. It examines the trajectory of scientific advances and notes that they do not happen as a result of accumulated facts, as it is often taught in secondary and post-secondary classes, but through the intellectual circumstances and possibilities of different cultures. This allows us to think more deeply about historical power imbalances. For example, who placed themselves in the position to appropriate, and the underlying meritocracy and neoliberalism today in science education and science education research. These are important to think about in critical, equity-oriented research. If they are not explicit in your research questions, these are key considerations in your selections of theoretical underpinnings, methodological approaches, and analytic lens. Challenge assumptions of neutrality and objectivity through critical inquiry, both in thinking about the influence of social identities in science learning, but also how societal, political, historical factors intersect and influence social phenomena in learning design, and learning environments. Research approaches with critical and intersectional lens allows us to ask the right questions that elucidate these factors and develop learning frameworks and approaches that are humanizing and culturally aligned, and both leverage and build on the assets and experience that learners bring into the learning environment. Decentering hegemonic notions of knowledge production means recognizing the role of power in the production and dissemination of scientific knowledge. In science education research, this has relevance in several areas of our practice. Literature and theory. Make sure that you are critical in your citation practices. Draw from works of scholars of color. We are doing important research in all areas of work, and it is important to build on this work. Research has demonstrated that although scholars of color produce the more innovation, they receive the least amount of citations. This is an indication as to how and where innovations are picked up. If we want to advance equitable learning for all learners, it is important that we are building on the most innovative research. Mignolo's notion of epistemic disobedience, which means disrupting rarefied systems of knowledge production and knowing, including traditional silos of the university, and valuing and centering indigenous traditional knowledge as necessary in holistic approaches to scientific knowing and knowledge production. In research, we can ask questions like, what is learning? How does it look? What might be the ways that learning is happening that might not be visible to me due to my own positionality? Similar to hegemonic notions of what counts as science, we have hegemonic notions of what counts as learning. We could go back to the discussion of meritocracy and talk about standardized tests, as well as other measures of learning and how learning is assessed. It is important for us to move beyond these standard measures and expand our descriptions of how science learning happens and how it is evidenced. For example, what are embodied approaches to science learning that are embedded in communities and cultures? What are the ways that artistic expressions are evidence of science learning and knowledge? Situate land, place, and space. How do notions of land influence learning and scientific knowledge production? What are the relationships between your research participants and land? What is your relationship with land? What are the land relationships of indigenous peoples, descendants of enslaved Africans, immigrants, descendants of colonizers? What do you know about the indigenous stewards of the land where you do research? Who are the most marginalized in respect to the land on which you are doing your research? How does your relationship to land influence your positionality as a researcher? As science education researchers, we also consider the context of science learning. Is it formal versus informal, community-based, design space like a museum, outdoor space? What about the conceptual or ideological spaces that can be ephemeral, tacit, or invisible? This could bring us back to the historical, political, and social constructs that structure learning contexts, as well as the ideas, worldviews, and diverse perspectives that different stakeholders bring into the learning context. Privilege, process over product. Many science education research projects also include some element of learning design. In these kinds of projects, it is important to center humanizing practices, especially for those who have been scientifically dehumanized. This means valuing the knowledge and perspectives that students bring into, or learning participants bring into the space, as well as the ways that they demonstrate learning. Center the participants' culture and avoid assimilationist approaches to learning. This is learning and research as emphasizes students fitting into a science learning context rather than expanding that context to give students a sense of belonging. Center trust and relationship building before, during, and after the research process. Take the time to do just research and also find ways to disseminate your research beyond the academy and in ways that will engage and empower participants and their communities. Think about things like podcasts, zines, artistic expressions, social media, prose writing, etc. Promote participatory learning and research. This means engage collaborative and participatory approaches to research in ways that also include research participants, especially youth participants. Be mindful of the researcher-participant power dynamics and how this can influence the research process. However, avoid tokenizing or essentializing the young people or others in the process, but find ways that value their engagement and perspectives as central as the theoretical PhD student level knowledge that you are bringing into the context. We can think about Santos's notion of epistemic justice, which is the equal treatment of all knowledges.
my soul. I will come to your river, wash my soul again. Carry away my dead leaves, let me baptize my soul with the help of your waters. Sing my pains and complaints, let the river take them, river.